This is a Dutch testing report tutorial to assist you with the interpretation of results. Please do keep in mind these videos are for educational information only, not for medical advice. The results that we're showing on the screen are not from a particular patient. When we're looking at the cortisol, there's a lot of data. We want to look primarily at the free cortisol pattern, which tells us what the circulating cortisol is looking like at different time points, and then we're also going to add those up, which gives you an idea of the total for free cortisol. Now, we don't want to use that as a marker for anything more than free and circulating cortisol, because the total production of cortisol is better approximated by total cortisol production. Those are our normal realities with cortisol. However, in this particular case, the patient appears to be taking cortisol supplementation. The results are on the higher side, so we're presuming that sometime during the testing they're probably taking the cortisol. You definitely want to know that for sure from the patient, whether they were on or not on the oral hydrocortisone or cortisol during the test. And keep in mind, hydrocortisone is cortisol. It's the same thing. Because in interpretation, you have to put it in the context of the supplementation. So the two options typically are to either take it during the test. So if you take it right upon waking, then this morning result is going to be an idea of your exposure to cortisol from what you make plus what you take. If you don't take it the morning of the test, then this morning result is going to be, of course, just from what you're actually making, not from the exogenous hormone. However, you also want to keep in mind a couple things about the metabolites. The metabolites follow a different pattern. So if you have a peak in the morning of free cortisol, the metabolites will actually peak later in the day. And they don't go up and down as much. It's a gentler curve and it's later. Okay? But in addition to that, when you take oral cortisol, it goes into the gut. In the gut, it gets turned into these metabolites. Now, if it gets turned into the metabolites in the gut, it's never been in circulation as free cortisol. Right? Some of that is going to go into circulation as free cortisol and then go into the gut, and then be metabolized and then excreted. And some of it's going to be turned into a metabolite and excreted without getting into circulation as free cortisol. So in that sense, when you're on oral cortisol therapy during the test, that metabolized cortisol number gets, you might say, artificially bloated or increased due to that gut metabolism. So if you're on a quote-unquote normal dose of cortisol, usually those metabolites will be a little bit elevated. So the overall information that we're looking at cortisol. It's made from the adrenal gland, but in this case they may be taking it also. Then it gets converted to cortisone, and it can circulate in either form. Right? So because of that, we also want to check the free cortisone pattern. Then it's metabolized to the cortisol and cortisone metabolites. And again, that metabolized cortisol, the total of those, is an important measurement, but has to be interpreted correctly. Oftentimes when the metabolites get very, very big and the free cortisol isn't, it might be a picture of somewhat increased cortisol clearance. Right? So if the cortisol clearance is increased, you're going to get a higher number here for the metabolites in a relative sense than you get for the free cortisol. And sometimes that's because of obesity, sometimes high thyroid, long-term exposure to cortisol. But again, in a case like this, you don't want to overinterpret that when the metabolites are excessively high because of this gut metabolism issue, that those get increased differently when you're taking cortisol by mouth. Okay, so we want to keep that in mind. Now, if you want to look at the overall preference between active and inactive cortisol, that's what this index here is looking at the overall metabolites of cortisol and cortisone, and looking at which way that's pointing to see if there's a preference one way or the other. But again, you've got to interpret this carefully, given that the patient appears to be on some sort of cortisol therapy. Verify with the patient when they took it last, and then you'll want to make sure and interpret it correctly. I hope that's been helpful. If you have any questions from the patient perspective, please do send those back to your healthcare provider, and we thank you for testing with us.